The wind howled across the frozen plains of Alnora, a relentless beast that clawed through the darkness. Snow swirled in thick, suffocating sheets, consuming the horizon in a blinding void of white. The storm was merciless, a force of nature that devoured the unprepared. Dr. Evan Hart sat hunched over the control panel of his medical crawler, his fingers tapping anxiously against the console. The distress signal had come in just 30 minutes ago, an old, weak frequency barely able to cut through the interference of the storm. Someone was out there. Someone was dying. His breath fogged against the visor of his environmental suit as he tightened his grip on the controls. The crawler's engines groaned under the weight of the snowdrifts, pushing forward at a crawl. The harsh light from its beams barely cut through the whiteout, illuminating jagged ice formations and nothing more. Evan exhaled sharply. He had been stationed on Alnora for just over a year now, assigned to one of the many isolated outposts dedicated to humanitarian aid across the galaxy. Officially, his job was to provide medical support to stranded miners, lost traders, and the occasional refugee fleeing conflicts from distant systems. But never had he encountered a distress signal out here, in the deep wastes. The storm intensified, slamming against the crawler with a force that made the metal creak. His console blared a warning. Temperature readings outside had plummeted to lethal levels. Exposure for more than a few minutes would mean certain death. Still, the signal remained. His heart pounded as the tracker beeped again, guiding him toward a small, faint heat signature buried beneath the snow. There. A barely visible structure, half swallowed by ice, its entrance blocked by a thick layer of frost. Evan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his medkit, pulled his insulated hood over his head, and activated the crawler's stabilizers. The moment the hatch hissed open, the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. Bracing against the storm, he pushed forward, his boots sinking into knee-deep snow. His gloved hands fumbled against the ice-covered entrance, gripping the emergency cutting tool strapped to his belt. He activated it, the blade slicing through the frozen buildup in jagged lines. The ice cracked. With a final heave, he forced the door open. Inside, the air was still and deathly cold. His headlamp illuminated the small space, casting long shadows against the cracked walls. And then, a shape. Huddled in the farthest corner, wrapped in a thin, ragged blanket, was a woman. Not human. Her skin was a dusky violet, her features sharp, her once regal attire torn and barely shielding her from the cold. Beside her, curled against her unmoving form, was a child, small, fragile, shivering violently. Evan dropped to his knees. His scanner beeped wildly, flashing critical readings, severe hypothermia, oxygen levels dangerously low. The woman's breath was shallow, barely more than a whisper of air against her lips. Her eyes fluttered weakly at the sudden intrusion, her gaze unfocused, her body completely still beneath the tattered fabric. No, not still. Frozen. She wasn't moving because she couldn't. Evan's stomach clenched. She was paralyzed. Evan worked fast. His hands moved on instinct, trained from years of emergency response. He ripped open his medkit, pulling out heat packs and pressing them against the woman's torso, her arms, her legs, anywhere he could force warmth back into her body. The child. Gods. The child was barely breathing. Evan scooped the small frame into his arms, his scanner confirming the worst. Core temperature critically low. He pressed the child against his own chest, wrapping his insulated coat around them, trying to force his body heat into the frozen limbs. The woman stirred. A faint, almost imperceptible whimper escaped her lips. Evan leaned in close, his breath warm against her frostbitten skin. "You're going to be okay. I'm here to help." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her body shuddered violently under the sudden warmth, her muscles weak and unresponsive. The storm howled through the open entrance, icy tendrils of wind creeping inside. He didn't have much time. Evan secured the emergency blankets around them, one over the woman, another over the child, and activated the internal heating units embedded in the fabric. The blankets pulsed with gentle warmth, designed to stabilize body temperature without shocking the system. The woman's silver eyes fluttered open, hazy with exhaustion, her gaze locking onto his. She tried to speak again, her throat too dry, too cold. "Save." The word barely escaped her lips, fragile and raw. Evan nodded sharply. "I'm getting you both out of here." She exhaled, her body sagging as unconsciousness threatened to pull her under again. Evan adjusted his hold, lifting the child securely against his chest before wrapping his other arm beneath the woman's shoulders. He could feel the stiffness in her frame, the unnatural stillness of her lower body. A spinal injury. Paralysis. Her exile here had not been an accident. Someone had ensured she would not walk away from her fate. Rage simmered beneath Evan's controlled exterior, but he pushed it aside. There would be time for questions later. Right now, they had to survive. With a final, determined breath, he carried them out of the frozen shelter and into the storm. The wind hit like a wall of knives, cutting through his insulated gear, searing against exposed skin. He forced himself forward, step by agonizing step, his boots sinking into the snow, his arms tightening around his fragile cargo. The crawler's beacon flickered through the blinding white, distant, but reachable. Evan pressed on, the woman's faint breath against his neck, the child's small body trembling against his chest. They were alive, and he would make damn sure they stayed that way. The world outside was an unforgiving hell of ice and wind, but Evan had no time to think about the storm biting at his exposed skin, nor the deep burn in his muscles as he carried the frozen woman and child through the knee-high drifts. His breaths came sharp and fast, fogging against the inside of his visor. The crawler loomed ahead, its emergency beacon flashing in steady, rhythmic pulses, a lifeline in the blinding storm. Evan's steps grew heavier, his limbs sluggish under the weight of exhaustion. He gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to keep moving, even as the wind clawed at him, trying to drag him and the fragile lives in his arms back into the abyss. The child shivered weakly against his chest, a faint whimper lost in the roar of the storm. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it sent a surge of desperate determination through Evan's body. Almost there. One step, then another. Finally, the crawler's outer hatch hissed open, spilling warmth into the frozen air. He stumbled inside, the doors sealing shut behind him, locking the storm outside. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by his own ragged breaths and the faint beeping of his med scanner. Evan wasted no time. He lowered the child onto the cot first, wrapping another thermal blanket around the small, trembling body before turning his attention to the mother. She was still, too still. His heart slammed against his ribs as he pressed his fingers against her throat, searching for a pulse. Weak. Faint. But there. He exhaled sharply, pushing past the rising dread in his chest. He had seen patients in this state before, hovering on the edge of life and death, their bodies barely holding on. The cold had slowed her heartbeat, but if he didn't get warmth into her fast enough, that heartbeat would stop altogether. Carefully, he removed the thin, tattered fabric she had used as a makeshift shield against the cold. Underneath, her dusky violet skin was frostbitten along her arms, her fingers stiff, her lips tinged with an unhealthy shade of blue. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale barely more than a whisper. She had been strong, holding on for her child, fighting through the pain of a body that could no longer carry her. But she had nothing left. Evan moved on instinct, pulling the emergency heater from the wall and adjusting the settings for gradual rewarming. He placed the device beside her, its gentle waves of heat radiating outward, bringing life back into her frozen form inch by inch. Her eyelids fluttered. A faint gasp slipped past her lips. Evan leaned closer, watching her carefully. "You're safe," he said, his voice steady, reassuring. "I've got you." Her silver eyes cracked open, unfocused, but there was something there. Recognition, awareness, the remnants of a fight that had not yet burned out. Then, softly, she whispered, "Mika?" Evan turned his head toward the cot. The child, Mika, was still wrapped in the thermal blanket, breathing slow and deep. The danger wasn't gone, but for now, they were both alive. He looked back at the woman. "He's all right. He's going to be all right." Her lips parted slightly, a breath of relief escaping as her eyes fluttered closed again. Evan sat back, rubbing a hand down his face. He had pulled them from the snow, but the battle wasn't over, not yet. Now, he needed answers. Hours passed. The warmth of the crawlers slowly pushed the frost from their bodies, their vitals stabilizing under Evan's constant care. The child, Mika, had stirred first, his small body shifting beneath the blankets. His silver eyes had blinked open, dazed and confused, but alive. The woman, his mother, remained unconscious. Evan sat beside her, his fingers drumming against his knee as he studied her face. She was beautiful, even in her fragile state, but there was something else something regal in the way she held herself, even in unconsciousness. This wasn't just any refugee. The markings on her arms, the intricate patterns woven into the fabric of her ruined cloak, he had seen them before. Not on patients, not on traders or settlers, on royalty. A sick feeling curled in his gut. Whoever had left her out there hadn't just been discarding a burden. They had been erasing a threat. Mika shifted in his cot, his small fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. Evan turned toward him. "You're awake." The boy tensed, his silver eyes darting to his mother before snapping back to Evan. His shoulders were stiff, wary. "It's all right," Evan said gently. "You're safe." Mika didn't respond right away. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "Are we dead?" Evan's chest tightened. "No," he said firmly. "You're alive. You both are." Mika hesitated, then slowly sat up, the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. His gaze flickered to his mother again. "She's not waking up." "She will," Evan assured him. "She just needs time." Mika bit his lip, his small fingers clutching the fabric of his blanket like it was the only thing anchoring him. Then softly he said, "She can't walk." Evan had suspected as much, but hearing it from Mika made it real. "Has she always been paralyzed?" he asked carefully. Mika shook his head. "No." His voice wavered. They hurt her. They said she was broken." Evan inhaled slowly, forcing his hands to stay steady as he reached for his scanner. He had seen injuries like this before: spinal trauma, deliberate nerve damage meant to strip someone of power without killing them outright. It was cruel, efficient, and whoever had done this had left her to die in the cold, ensuring no one would ever hear her story. But Mika had defied that fate. He had activated the distress beacon. He had saved her. Evan swallowed the anger rising in his throat. "Who did this to her?" he asked. Mika hesitated, his small hands curled into fists. Finally he whispered, "The king." Evan stiffened. He had been right. She wasn't just anyone. She was a queen. And now, she was his responsibility. Evan exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He had saved a mother and her child, not knowing the weight of what he had done. Now there was no going back. Whoever had left her to die would not forget her. And if they learned she had survived, they would come back to finish the job. Evan's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to let that happen. The soft hum of the medical scanner filled the space, its rhythmic pulses confirming what Evan had feared. The woman's spinal column had been damaged deliberately. Not a natural injury, not an accident. This had been done to her. He stared at the readings, jaw tightening. He had worked on the battlefield, treated soldiers with blast wounds and shattered limbs, patched up men who should have died but somehow refused to let go. But this was systematic, a calculated attempt to strip someone of power, to leave them helpless. Mika sat quietly on the edge of the cot, watching him with wary, unblinking silver eyes. He hadn't spoken much since revealing the truth, since whispering that single word that changed everything. King. Not a king. The king, the ruler of this system. The man who had sent his own queen and child to die in a frozen wasteland. Evan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. There was no room for anger. Not yet. The woman, Mirakai, Mika had finally told him, was still unconscious, her body weak from days in the cold. But she was alive, and that meant she could be saved. The question was how. Evan had patched up hundreds of injuries in his life, but reversing paralysis caused by deliberate nerve damage? That wasn't something he could fix with a standard med kit. He needed technology. Advanced equipment far beyond what this small outpost had. He needed a miracle. Mika shifted slightly, his small hands tightening around the edge of the blanket. "Can you help her?" His voice was quiet, but there was something sharp beneath it, something that made Evan hesitate. This wasn't just a boy asking if his mother would wake up. This was an heir asking if his mother could stand again. Evan rubbed a hand down his face, weighing his words carefully. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to try." Mika stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. Evan glanced at Mirakai again. Even unconscious, there was something regal about her, something unyielding. This was a woman who had once commanded an empire, and now she was completely at the mercy of a stranger. She had lost everything, but she wasn't dead. And Evan intended to keep it that way. The first thing Mirakai became aware of was warmth. It seeped into her frozen skin, chasing away the bitter cold that had wrapped around her for what felt like an eternity. She let herself sink into it for a moment, afraid to move, afraid to open her eyes and find that the warmth was nothing more than a dream. Then she felt it. Pain. A dull ache in her limbs, a sharp sting in her chest when she inhaled too deeply. She had known pain before, far worse than this, but this pain meant something. It meant she was alive. A sound reached her ears, a faint beeping, rhythmic and steady, a medical scanner. The soft hum of a ship's life support system. The air around her smelled clean, sterile. She was inside, not in the snow, not in the cold. Her fingers twitched. It took effort, more than it should have, but they moved. A small hand brushed against hers, and then, "Mother?" Her heart clenched at the sound. Her eyes snapped open. Mika sat beside her, his silver eyes wide, his small hands clutching hers as if he feared she might disappear if he let go. His face was thinner than she remembered, exhaustion clinging to his small frame, but he was alive. A shuddering breath escaped her lips, and she reached for him with weak, trembling fingers, pulling him against her chest. His warmth, his heartbeat against her skin, it was real. He was real. She had not lost him. She closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her cheek against his soft hair. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're safe." Mika clung to her tighter. "We both are." She frowned slightly at his words. Slowly, she lifted her gaze and met the eyes of the human standing at the edge of the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in simple but functional clothing. His face was lined with exhaustion, his hazel eyes sharp and assessing. She knew immediately. He was the one who had saved them. Her throat was raw, her voice barely above a whisper, but she forced the words out. "Who are you?" The man crossed his arms, leaning against the console with a faint smirk. "Dr. Evan Hart," he said. "And you've got a lot of explaining to do, Your Majesty." Mirakai froze, her heart pounded against her ribs. So he knew. She didn't know whether that was a blessing or a curse. She glanced at Mika, who looked down, avoiding her gaze. He had told him. She couldn't blame him. They were alive because of this man. Slowly, she turned her attention back to Evan. His expression was unreadable, but there was no hostility in his gaze, no fear, just curiosity. And something else, something that made her uneasy. He wasn't just curious about who she was. He was calculating, weighing options, considering outcomes. She had spent her entire life surrounded by men who measured power, who understood the delicate balance of risk and reward. And this human? He was considering his next move. Mirakai swallowed hard, shifting her body slightly. The attempt to sit up was futile. Her legs remained useless, unresponsive. Evan noticed immediately. His smirk faded. "You can't move," he said, more statement than question. She exhaled slowly. "No." His gaze flickered. "For how long?" 3 years. A muscle tightened in his jaw. "And it was done to you." She hesitated, then softly, "Yes." Evan let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. Mirakai frowned. "What?" He glanced at her, his hazel eyes sharp. "You know what kind of mess you've put me in?" Mirakai straightened as much as she could. "You could have left us in the storm," she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its old strength, "yet you didn't." Evan sighed. "Yeah, well, it's a bad habit of mine. Saving people." She studied him carefully. He was an enigma. A human doctor, alone in the outer territories, treating patients on a frozen world that had no value to the galaxy at large. Why was he here? Why had he helped? And more importantly, what did he intend to do now that he knew exactly who he had saved? Evan pushed away from the console, stretching his arms. "All right," he said. "Here's the deal. You need medical care, and I'm the only one who can give it to you. So you're staying here until we figure this out." Mirakai arched a brow. "And what do you get out of this?" Evan smirked. "I have a feeling you're going to make things very interesting." Mirakai stared at him. For the first time in years, she felt something other than fear. Something dangerous. Something alive. She felt hope. The outpost's medical bay hummed with quiet energy, the soft beeping of vitals monitors the only sound besides the occasional gust of wind rattling the exterior. Mirakai sat in the hover chair Evan had rigged together from scavenged parts, her posture straight, her expression composed, but there was no mistaking the tension in her body. Evan could see it in the way her fingers gripped the armrests, how she glanced toward Mika every few moments as if reassuring herself that he was still here, still breathing, still hers. He didn't blame her. The woman had lost everything. She had been cast aside, betrayed, and left to rot in the cold. Now, she was in the hands of a human stranger who had patched her up and given her warmth when her own people had discarded her like refuse. Evan sat across from her, arms crossed, studying her just as she studied him. "We need to talk about your condition," he finally said. Mirakai's silver eyes flicked up to meet his. She said nothing, waiting. Evan leaned back slightly, resting his ankle over his knee. "Your spinal damage is extensive. Whoever did this to you made sure it wasn't something you could recover from on your own." His voice was steady, clinical. "But it's not irreversible." Mika, who had been playing with a small diagnostic pad on the floor nearby, froze. His head snapped up. "You mean you can fix her?" Mirakai's hands tensed on the armrests. Evan exhaled. "Not with the tech I have here, but there's a way." Silence stretched between them. Mirakai was the first to break it. "Where?" Evan hesitated. He had expected her to be skeptical, suspicious, maybe even hopeful. But there was something about the way she asked. Where? Not how. Not, "Are you sure?" She already knew that if there was a way, she would take it. Evan tapped a few commands into his holopad, and a projection flickered to life between them. A distant star system glowed on the screen, marked with a small, pulsing signal. "There's an independent station on the outskirts of the Loris sector," Evan explained. "It's off the main trade routes. No formal alliances, but they specialize in cybernetic neural interfaces." He met her gaze. "They could help you walk again." Mika's breath hitched. "Then let's go." Mirakai, however, was silent. Evan frowned slightly. "You don't want this?" She inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the arms of her chair before she finally spoke. "I don't know if I can afford it." Evan arched a brow. "You're a queen." Her lips curved, but there was no amusement in the expression. "Was." The word hung between them like a ghost. Evan leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "You're still breathing, that means you're still a queen." Something flickered in her silver eyes. It wasn't hope, it was resolve. She glanced at Mika, then back at Evan. "We need to leave soon," she said. Evan smirked. "Yeah," he agreed. "We do." The Nightingale was a small, sturdy medical transport. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy, but reliable. It was built for long hauls and quick maneuvering, designed to keep its passengers alive rather than impress anyone. Evan ran through pre-flight checks, his fingers moving automatically over the controls, but his mind was elsewhere. Mirakai and Mika were in the back, securing what little supplies they had. The outpost had been home for over a year, but now he was leaving it behind, just like that. Because of them. Because of her. The realization should have unsettled him. It didn't. The calm crackled as Mirakai's voice came through. "Are we ready?" Evan flipped the last few switches and exhaled. "Yeah, hold tight." The engines roared to life, and the Nightingale lifted from the frozen ground, breaking free of the storm and ascending into the dark sky. Evan glanced at the nav screen. The Loris station was days away, but that wasn't what worried him. What worried him was the possibility that Mirakai's enemies had already realized she was alive, and that they would come for her before she ever had a chance to walk again. The Nightingale drifted through the darkness of space, the hum of its engines the only sound in the otherwise silent void. Evan sat in the pilot's seat, his fingers drumming against the console as the nav computer projected their course. The Loris station was still several hours away, and so far their flight had been uneventful. Too uneventful. He had been running rescues and medevacs in dangerous sectors long enough to know when something felt wrong. The tension in his gut told him this was one of those times. Behind him, Mirakai sat in the co-pilot's chair, her silver eyes focused on the vast expanse beyond the viewport. She had been quiet since they left Alnora, her thoughts locked behind that unreadable expression she wore like armor. Evan glanced at her. "You're thinking too hard." She didn't look at him. "I have a lot to think about." He exhaled, leaning back in his seat. "You're wondering what happens next." Mirakai finally turned to face him. "I'm wondering if I'm making a mistake." Evan arched a brow. "Getting your legs back?" "Trusting you." That stung a little, but Evan didn't let it show. He just shrugged. "Fair enough. I don't expect you to trust me, but I expect you to trust yourself." He tapped the console. "You made the call. You're still making the call." She studied him as if weighing his words, but before she could respond, the alarm on the control panel flared red. "Proximity alert." Evan's gut clenched. He slammed a button on the console, switching to external sensors. The hollow display flickered to life, revealing a ship lurking in the darkness behind them. No markings, no beacon, no identification. A predator. Mirakai leaned forward, her voice low. "They found me." Evan's hands tightened on the controls. "Yeah, I figured." A second later, the comms crackled to life. A voice, smooth, unhurried, filtered through the speakers. "Nightingale, you are carrying stolen cargo. Stand down and we will be merciful." Evan let out a humorless laugh. "I love how they never say what the cargo is." He cut the transmission before they could say anything else and looked at Mirakai. "This is your old buddy, isn't it?" Her jaw was tight. "One of them." Evan sighed. "All right then." Without another word, he flipped the Nightingale into an aggressive climb, pushing the engines to their limit. The ship groaned in protest, but the thrusters held, sending them into a sharp, unpredictable ascent. The pursuers reacted immediately, their engines flaring as they gave chase. The comms crackled again, but Evan ignored it. They had no intention of letting them go. Mirakai's hands gripped the armrests. "Can we outrun them?" Evan's smirk was sharp. "Nope, but I wasn't planning on running." She looked at him sharply. "Then what?" He hit the emergency override, cutting the main thrusters and letting the ship drop. Mirakai sucked in a breath as the artificial gravity struggled to compensate. The pursuers overshot them, their momentum carrying them forward. Evan slammed the controls, reigniting the engines at full power. The Nightingale surged forward, now behind the enemy ship. "Hang on," Evan muttered. With a flick of his wrist, he triggered the ship's forward thrusters, sending them barreling toward an asteroid belt in the distance. The enemy ship corrected, angling to pursue, but Evan knew this game better than they did. They had numbers, he had experience. The ship dove between jagged rock formations, weaving through narrow passages at breakneck speed. The enemy hesitated, their larger frames struggling to keep up. Mirakai exhaled slowly. "You've done this before." Evan grinned. "You'd be amazed what a guy learns in med school." A sharp burst of light flared behind them as the pursuing ship clipped the edge of an asteroid. Not enough to destroy them, but enough to force them to fall back. The chase was over. The Nightingale shot forward, leaving them behind. Mirakai exhaled, her fingers finally unclenching from the chair. "That was reckless," Evan smirked. "That was necessary." She shook her head, but there was something else in her expression now. Something like trust. Evan didn't acknowledge it. He just turned back to the controls. "All right," he murmured. "Let's get you walking again." The Laura's station floated ahead of them, a sprawling hub of interconnected rings and docking bays, its exterior dark but pulsing with internal energy. This was a place where secrets were sold, where debts were repaid in blood or fortune, and where the line between hero and criminal blurred beyond recognition. It was exactly what they needed. Evan guided the Nightingale into the docking bay, shutting down the engines as the landing clamps engaged. He glanced at Mirakai. "You ready for this?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at her unmoving legs, her expression unreadable. Then she met his gaze. Yes. Mika had fallen asleep in the back, exhaustion finally catching up to him, but Evan knew he'd want to be there when his mother took her first steps again. Together, they disembarked, moving through the dimly lit corridors toward the station's medical wing. The air was thick with the scent of oil and sterilization, a contradiction that Evan had long since stopped noticing in places like this. A man met them at the entrance, a Lorian with mechanical implants along his temples, his green eyes scanning them with cold efficiency. "You have the credits?" he asked. Evan smirked. "I have something better." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive. The Lorian's gaze sharpened. "This," Evan said, "is a full database of human neural integration research. Technology your kind has been trying to get their hands on for decades." He tossed the drive between his fingers before catching it again. "So tell me, are you going to fix her spine, or are we taking our business elsewhere?" The Lorian studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smirked. "I liked you, human." The deal was struck. Hours later, Mirakai lay on the operating table, a mask pressed over her face as the machines worked, as long-damaged nerves were reconnected, as the technology of two species fused into something entirely new. Evan sat outside, rubbing his temples, exhaustion settling in. He had expected this to be the end of the road, but it wasn't. Because when Mirakai finally stepped out of the medbay, her legs moving, her posture tall, her silver eyes gleaming, he realized something. She wasn't just walking, she was rising. A queen, reborn. And he had a feeling this was only the beginning. She looked at him then, something unreadable in her gaze. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured. Evan smirked, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, guess I've got a thing for impossible cases." She took a step forward, then another, and then she kissed him. It was quick, barely more than a brush of lips, but when she pulled back, Evan was completely still. Mirakai smiled, something dangerous and alive in her expression. "Consider that my first repayment." Evan blinked. Then finally he grinned. "Well," he murmured, "I'm looking forward to the rest."